Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased and honored to have been invited by the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research to be with you here this evening. I've been very impressed and gratified to see so many supporters of the State of Israel here in Montreal. We in Israel very much appreciate your support. And at these times, which are difficult times, that I will mention during my talk, your support is very much needed. So, keep doing what you're doing. The organizers of this event have, in my view, quite properly arranged for the speeches to be given after dinner. I can tell you from experience that there's nothing more difficult than addressing an audience that is hungry. Now, of course, there also are some disadvantages with after dinner speeches. The evening goes on, people get a little edgy. They're thinking of going home. I gave a talk at an after-dinner event one evening, which dragged on with many greetings and short speeches and introductions. And about 10 minutes to 11, my turn came, and so it was late. I asked the chairman, well, how long should I speak? He said, you can speak as long as you want. We go home at 11. Professor Grants was a little worried that I hadn't been eating too much. And there's another story about the after-dinner speaker who came to the dinner with his wife. Everybody was eating, and he didn't eat. And his wife said, why don't you eat? He says, I have to concentrate on the speech that I'm going to give. I can't eat. So when dinner was over, he got up to give his talk. After the talk, he asked his wife, well, how was it? She said, you might just as well have eaten. I'm sharing this podium with Barry Rubin, whom you all know, whose columns in the Jerusalem Post I read religiously. And I don't want to drag out too long, so he doesn't have to undergo the experience that I just recounted. So I'll try to be reasonably brief. Now, coming to Canada yesterday, I remembered a meeting I had with some Canadian Jewish supporters of the State of Israel many years ago, over 20 years ago, when I was Israel's foreign minister in Jerusalem. And I decided to use the opportunity to get something off my chest. And I said to them, you know, Israel and the United States have a tremendous relationship. It is based on common values and on common ideals. In this day and age, common ideals and values also make for common strategic interests. And I've always wondered, I said at the time, why we don't have a similar relationship with Canada. After all, we share common values, we share common ideals. Having been defense minister before, I knew that at the time, there was nothing that we in Israel could acquire in Canada that was even remotely related to defense. We couldn't buy buttons for military uniforms in Canada. Canada's relationship to Israel was very, very cool for many, many years, as I'm sure you know. And my remarks were reported in Canada and they caused something of turmoil. but I think they were pretty much to the point. I remember that meeting because, as I don't need to tell you, things have changed. And you have a Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who's been an outright and forceful supporter of the State of Israel. Support that we need at this time. We are not at war, but we face an onslaught, a worldwide onslaught that you at the CIJR know all about. And when the Prime Minister of Canada, at a meeting of the G8, objects to a resolution that was introduced and was supposed to have been passed unanimously, asking, suggesting, telling Israel that it should negotiate with the Palestinians on the basis of the 1967 borders that President Obama mentioned in his meeting with Netanyahu. And the Prime Minister of Canada gets up and takes exception to that. Now that, my friends, is a great thing, and a great thing for Israel. The State of Israel did not come into being, as is sometimes mistakenly said, especially lately, as a result of a UN resolution. The State of Israel came into being after the declaration by David Ben-Gurion on the 15th of May, 1948, as a result of a very difficult war of independence that lasted for over a year. When a small community of 600,000 Jews in what was then Palestine fought off the combined armies of 40 million Arab neighbors. Regular armies with planes and tanks and navies that were opposed by a small militia. A war in which out of 600,000, 6,000 men and women fell. And in that war, we were aided by a few thousand that came to join us from the diaspora. From the United States, from Canada, from South Africa, some from Europe, and their help was invaluable. If instead of a few thousand, there were tens of thousands that come, things would have been a great deal easier. The victory would have been more decisive. And some of the problems that we face today, we might not have had to face. But still, it was an indication of the interdependence, of the need for support that Israel had at the time, and has today as well, and today especially, of world Jewry. One of those who came and made a signal contribution to Israel's victory in the War of Independence came from Canada. It was Ben Duckelman from Toronto, who had been a decorated officer in the Canadian Army in World War II and commanded the IDF 7th Brigade in the liberation of the Gala. The War of Independence was the first war. It wasn't the last war, as you well know. We went through a succession of wars where Arab armies came out of Israel, time and again, losing every time and expecting that the next time around they were going to be victorious. The Sinai campaign of 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. In all of them, Israel was victorious and paid a heavy price, especially in the War of 1973. But it was that war which was started under the most inauspicious circumstances for Israel. Israel was surprised in the north and the south on Yom Kippur hit back, and 3 weeks later, the IDF was 101 kilometers from Cairo and within artillery range of Damascus. And that was the last time that an attempt was made by military force, by tanks and aircraft on the battlefield to defeat the state of Israel. It was the last time because Israel's victory in 1973 made it crystal clear to the leaders in the Arab world, to the Arab generals, that they had no chance of defeating Israel on the battlefield. That is what we call deterrence. Since 1973, that today is close to 30 years, Israel has been able to deter the Arab armies from coming back and attacking Israel. But that, as you know, is not the end of the story. Looking for ways to attack Israel, despite their military inferiority, our enemies returned with another weapon: terrorism. Terrorism is the indiscriminate use of force against the civilian population. Not against Sahel, not against the Israeli army. It's too strong. Against Israeli civilians. Rockets that were launched by Hezbollah in Lebanon against the towns in northern Israel. Suicide bombers in the streets of Israel's cities. And what they were in effect saying is, we don't have tanks, we don't have aircraft, we don't have submarines like Israel. We have suicide bombers. And in return for the promise of the 72 virgins that will be awaiting the suicide bomber in heaven, he goes into the city of Israel, into a bus, into a place like this where people gather, to a Seder on Pesach, and he is a precision weapon. He picks the target, he goes to the target, and he explodes himself, and there are many, many casualties. In the years from 2000 to 2002, just a little over 10 years ago, we had suicide bombers, terrorist acts in Israel cities, almost daily, sometimes twice daily. And it became clear that terrorism, which many of us thought in previous years was a nuisance, something unpleasant, and something that couldn't really endanger the state of Israel, that terrorism had become a strategic threat to Israel. When mothers are afraid to send their children to school, when people don't want to go on a bus, when people don't want to visit restaurants, and that's the situation we were in those years, this gets to be a strategic threat, a threat to Israel's society, to the solidarity of Israel's society. Now, in those days, there were people in Israel who said you cannot fight terrorism by force. What is this meaning of this rather inane statement? You should negotiate with terrorists. Give them what they want. At least give them part of what they want. And there were others, and I among them, who said terrorism has to be dealt with by force and only by force. And Israel may be the first country in the world that had faced terrorism. And I don't believe that any country had ever faced terrorism on the scale that we did, right in the middle of our cities. Set an example that terrorism can be defeated. The IDF Sahel entered the Arab cities and towns in Judea and Samaria and put an end to the acts of terrorism from there. And from that area, which we are now being pressured to evacuate, or we are now being said to go back to what President Obama called the 1967 lines, from that area there has been no significant act of terrorism for the past 9 years, ever since the IDF entered the area. And we are not about to turn the clock back and to return to the situation that we're at the time. There's another terror weapon, and that's the rocket. It is a cheap weapon. It is firing indiscriminately into populated areas. It's a terror weapon because it is directed at civilians. It doesn't have to be accurate. Just fire it in the general direction of a town, of a village, of a populated area, and somebody's going to get hurt. And property is going to be damaged. We have had that problem from Gaza, where the Hamas terrorists took over after Israel unwisely uprooted the Israeli settlements in Gush Katif. That is a mistake that we're not going to repeat again. Rockets were raining down on the southern part of Israel, on Sderot, on the villages near the Gaza Strip, sometimes even on Beersheba, Ashkelon, Ashdod, without a substantial response, until the Israeli army finally went in Operation Cast Lead, put a stop to the launching of rockets from the area, but didn't finish the job. It should have taken the ability for launching rockets from there out of the hands of the Hamas. In my opinion, it should have liberated Gilad Shalit. That was the opportunity to do so. The job was left unfinished. And now our tradition tells us, Hamatchil b'mitzvah, omrim lo gmor. When you start with a mitzvah, finish it. You didn't finish it. It will still have to be finished. There are in Lebanon today, in the hands of Hezbollah, a terrorist organization, tens of thousands of rockets with the range to hit any part of Israel. As things stand at the moment, we have to take into consideration the possibility that if there were to be an outbreak of hostilities, the entire civilian population in Israel would be under threat, at least initially. That was a danger that we could have eliminated during the Second Lebanon War. Again, the job is not finished. The threat is still there, and we will have to deal with it. As I said, we scored a great victory against terrorism. And now, in recent years, we are being hit by another wave of attack against Israel. Not military action on the battlefield, not acts of terrorism, but in the political arena, in the diplomatic arena, in the economic arena, DBS, divesting, boycott, sanctions, at the UN. This now is a worldwide problem. It is directed against Israel. In great measure, it is directed against the Jewish people. And it requires a worldwide response. And this is why it requires the intense involvement of Jews all over the world and Israel supporters all over the world. At the UN, we're being threatened in September. At the UN General Assembly, our Defense Minister, Ehud Barak, and whenever he talks out of turn and says something that people don't like, some point an accusing finger at me because I appointed him Chief of Staff when I was Defense Minister, and I have to remind him that I did not appoint him to be Defense Minister. I appointed him to be Chief of Staff. He said not long ago, there's a tsunami coming in September. Well, today everybody in Israel and everybody in the world knows what a tsunami is. We saw that in Japan, something that devastated Japan after the earthquake. And here is the threat, presumably, that Israel will be devastated in September. Because at the UN General Assembly, they're going to propose a motion that people think will be passed for the creation of a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, along the lines that Barack Obama called the lines of 1967. I told our Defense Minister, Ehud Barak, September is not far away, and I can assure you Israel will be there in September, in October, in many months, and many years thereafter. Countries are not created by resolutions at the UN. Countries are created by struggle, by war, by boots on the ground, like Israel was created. I don't need to tell you that at the United Nations, there is an automatic majority for any motion against the state of Israel. There are 56 Islamic nations at the United Nations. They make up almost a third of the members of the United Nations. That General Assembly passed a resolution that said Zionism is racism, without getting a second thought. That, as you know, was eventually repealed. And whatever motion that might be offensive to Israel that will be brought to the United Nations, although we hear in recent days that the Palestinians are having second thoughts about whether this would really be wise, but any resolution that is offensive to Israel brought to the General Assembly will pass. Israel is treated as an outcast at the United Nations. Every member of the United Nations gets its turn at some point to be a member of the Security Council. Israel has never been a member of the Security Council, and never will be in this climate. Various Israeli UN institutions spend most of their time attacking Israel. They don't deal with the urgent problems in the world, and there's no shortage of them. They deal with Israel. After Operation Cast Lead, the Human Rights Commission set up the investigating committee headed by Richard Goldstone, a South African Jew, to investigate war crimes presumably committed by the IDF. Now, it's been said so many times, but I'll repeat it again because it's so true. There is no more humane army in the world than the IDF. You don't have to look at the military operations in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in other places where Western military forces are active and compare them to the activity of the IDF to see how true that statement is. But also to understand how dangerous this Goldstone report, this United Nations report, is to the defense of Israel. It is an attempt to disarm the state of Israel. The terrorists work from populated areas. This is what is called asymmetric warfare. They work from populated areas. And when an attempt is made through the UN to prevent Israel from responding to these attacks. In effect, an attempt is being made to leave Israel defenseless. In effect, the terrorists are encouraged to place their rocket launchers in schools, in mosques, in villages, and led to believe that Israel will not be able to respond. That is why there are today in Lebanon tens of thousands of missiles. They are not located in army camps. They are not located in military installations. They are located in schools, in mosques, in villages, in the expectation that they can be fired against Israel with impunity. So there is nothing more dangerous and nothing more lethal than trying to disarm Israel from protecting itself, and the people who are doing this are fully aware of that. Now, as if the UN was not enough, some new constructions are being built. One of them is the quartet. New constructs with the intention of opposing Israel, of attacking Israel, of pressuring Israel. What is the quartet? 1, the United Nations. 2, the European Union. 3, the United States. 4, Russia. No doubt the quartet will fall behind the speech of President Barack Obama that Israel should return to the 1967 lines. The 1967 lines, as I'm sure you remember, were referred to by Abba Eban, our great foreign minister, in a speech at the UN, as the Auschwitz orders. As our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said face to face with Barack Obama in a recent meeting at the White House, these lines are indefensible. Israel will not go back to these lines. And you know that Netanyahu achieved popularity ratings that peaked when he returned from Washington, because talking to most Israelis about the 1967 lines is like holding a red rag before a bull. Israelis do not want to go back to these lines. They know how dangerous going back to these lines would be for the state of Israel and for the people of Israel. Now, who are these people who are forming coalitions to attack Israel, to pressure Israel? They are, of course, the Arabs, Islamic nations, but that's not all. Lots of others. Lots of others who don't like the idea of the Jews being strong, or don't like the idea of the IDF being possibly one of the best armies in the world, who are sick and tired of being penitents about the Holocaust and would like to turn the tables on Israel. And out of the perverse offensive remarks that the Israeli army is a Nazi army, that Israel is an occupier, that Israel is oppressing other people, presumably like the Jews were oppressed is not the word, exterminated in Europe during World War II. And amongst these many who attack Israel on every occasion, in many forums, on the campuses of universities and colleges, United States and Canada and Western Europe, we find many Jews. There's an old tradition, maybe it's in our genes, amongst the Jewish people, of masochism, self-flagellation. I say many Jews, many Israelis, I'm sorry to say. And it is they that provide the grist for the mills of anti-Israeli propaganda. So this is the time for Jews and supporters of Israel to stand with Israel. And this is why the people of Israel are so deeply grateful to the Prime Minister of Canada. And we hope that many other statesmen will follow his position. So what I've outlined to you tonight are three phases of attacks against the Jewish state, against the state of Israel. The battlefield, followed by terrorism, and today, a phase of propaganda, of political attacks, of diplomatic attacks, of attempts to isolate the state of Israel, attempts to hurt Israel economically. We need your help, we need your involvement. This is why the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research is so important. And I can tell you, in conclusion, that just as we have won the military battle, and just as we have won the battle against terrorism, we're going to defeat the present onslaught as well.